Good. So yesterday we looked at this distinction between attention and concentration, and perhaps we can say these are associated with these two hemispheres of the brain individually, although one always has to remember that both hemispheres of the brain are involved in everything. Concentration, I was saying, can remain inherently self-centered, not in a necessarily bad or terrible way, but it remains centered on the perception of the world with me at the center of it, and things revolving around me or referring to me. And that's, a functional way of operating in the world. I've got to get to the airport at a certain time. So in a sense, the airport, either I revolve around the airport or the airport revolves around me, but I'm very much in the center of the picture. So it's good as far as it goes in living functionally, but we are capable of much more than that. When we pay attention, we do a work. It can just happen, where we sort of slip out of this self-centered view of the world. Remember, where we place our attention is reality, so we make the world that we live in through the way we look at it or perceive it. So we can just slip out of that left brain view of the world and find ourselves experiencing and nearly always enjoying the world and life, reality, being, consciousness. We can just slip into that. Maybe we are nudged into it by a beautiful piece of music or a moment of love or various moments or experiences, and sometimes for no reason at all, as children, I think, often experience. But generally speaking, we have to work at it. Attention is also a certain kind of work in which we take the center of consciousness off ourselves. I was making this distinction. It's not an opposition, it's not competition, but making this distinction, which is present in all the great spiritual traditions, Buddhism, Christianity, between mindfulness and meditation itself. There's a TED talk by quite a remarkable person called Jill, I think it's Bolt Taylor, who was a neurologist, American neurologist. She became fascinated by the brain because I think her brother, had some brain disorder or mental illness. And so she became interested in the brain at a very early age, became a leading researcher. And one day she got up in the morning and felt a bit strange. She lived on her own. And when she did her exercise, she felt it wasn't really her doing the exercise. But she needed to get to work, and then she had to have breakfast. And all the normal routine things that she was doing felt more and more strange. She felt more and more distant from them. Despite being a very smart person and a neurologist, she didn't realize what was happening until it had really started to happen. She realized she was having a stroke, which was affecting mostly, I think, the left-hand side of her brain. So she tried to make a phone call. She was mostly worried, however, about being late for work. So the old habits die hard. So even though she was having the stroke, her old sort of way of thinking was still dominant. she couldn't she couldn't use the phone. She didn't know how to relate the numbers on the keypad to the number that she was trying to remember. So she was completely dysfunctional, and of course, then began to experience more and more panic and fear, and then she flipped over into this state of euphoria, of bliss, of total happiness. She felt completely at one with everything. She says, what does she say? She says something like, you know, we are energy centers, we are flows of energy, and when we see, that means experience, the world from the other hemisphere of the brain, she says, we know that we are flowing with the flow, with all other beings. We look at other human beings as brothers and sisters engaged in this beautiful work of making the world, living in the world. And so her right hemisphere unleashed this torrent of creative and blissful energy. She felt totally connected to everything. And then she would go back, flip back immediately into the left hemisphere and see everything in terms of anxiety. She was going to be late for work, and would she finish her project, and all these anxieties began to flood into her. Then she'd go back again into this blissful state. So a kind of heaven and hell duality. The right hemisphere, she concluded, is concerned with or is aware of everything that is in the present moment. So everything we smell, everything we touch, everything we see, everything, and every kind of way we have of feeling it, experiencing it, is in the present moment, and that's what we can know and enter into through this right hemisphere. This is how she describes it. And whereas the left hemisphere is, of course, to do mainly with the past, drawing conclusions from the past and I suppose predicting the future. So we can see the relevance of this, I think, to, well, many other things. One of the things this reminds me of is a passage from St. Paul, the second letter to the Corinthians. And this is where he describes an experience not dissimilar from what Jill Bolt-Taylor described. He said, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body, I do not know, or out of the body, I do not know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the third heaven. He was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. So, this experience of the third heaven, in the Jewish mind, there were three heavens. There was the Earth's atmosphere. So looking up at the sky, it's cloudy today, that's the first. Then you have the starry heavens, you have the outer space, the Interstellar, if you've seen that film. So outer space. And then the third heaven is where God lives and where we are drawn, where we are attracted, where we are meant to go, to be with God in that third heaven. This day you will be with me in paradise, Jesus said to the good thief. So this experience, this mystical experience, he doesn't even say it was me that had it, because he had a different, clearly it is him, but it was an experience which redefined his own sense of self, of what I means, what I am, or who I am. He still had his difficult personality, and yet he was transformed. This passage occurs where he's talking about whether his relationship to the other apostles. And he came in late, but he said, I'm as good as you are. I'm as much an apostle as you. I didn't know Jesus in his lifetime, and it's true, I persecuted his followers, but then I had this revelation, this other great experience, his conversion moment, where Jesus said, why are you persecuting me? His eyes were opened, and he went blind, and took 3 years to recover from this breakdown, as we might call it today, and then, of course, became the great apostle to the Gentiles. So he was arguing about his own status, really, and he said, is he boasting about this? Well, if I was going to boast about anything, he said, I would boast about this experience that I'd had. But then this leads him on, as he reflects, as he explores this, the meaning of this, to boast of his weaknesses. Because he said, in order to prevent him from becoming conceited by this mystical experience, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and to keep me from becoming proud. Now, what do you think this thorn in the flesh is? Well, we probably all have something we could imagine it might be from our own experience. He asked God 3 times that it might leave him, because he thought he would, of course, be a better apostle, more successful at his job, if he was free from this thorn in the flesh, whatever it was. And but God didn't grant that prayer for a good reason, because God said to him, my grace is sufficient, because power is perfected in weakness. So we begin to see how success and failure begin to merge into each other here. Whose success? Whose failure? Whose work is it that he is doing? His own work, that he wants to feel a sense of satisfaction and pride in, and wants to be able to be free from this thorn in the flesh in order to achieve greater success? Or is it God's work, and really he's just a vehicle for it to happen? So clearly the ego has been denied what it wants, which of course we always interpret as a failure. I don't get what I want, I don't succeed, I don't achieve my goals. That is a failure. If failure means anything, that's what failure means. And we've seen, and we'll look now at the poem, what the feeling of that failure is like. And yet that perception of failure and the emotional flavor that it has, the feeling of the flavor of failure, can be perceived very differently when we look at it from the other side. Anyway, we could say here that the whole duality of failure and success, because you can't have failure without success, and if you have success, you're always going to be conscious of failure. So this whole duality, this whole system by which we live our lives, educate ourselves, or our children, or do our work and run our careers, doesn't everything revolves around these two values. You know, even an artist or an academic, pretty well everything we do that is meaningful work is going to be judged by these criteria of failure and success, even our personal lives, perhaps. So here we could see that in St. Paul, what St. Paul is describing is a resolution of this duality. Are they such real things after all? As Jill Bolt-Taylor was able to experience in those few hours of her stroke. It took her 7 years to recover from her stroke, but now she's on the circuit telling the world that we should live from the right-hand hemisphere. So, how has this been resolved? It's a contradiction, failure and success, and what happens when you unify a contradiction, you get a paradox. And a paradox is like a portal that you walk through. It's not an answer or a solution or an explanation even, but it's just a way of going through a narrow gate into some fuller experience of life, some fuller meaning. So what St. Paul is describing here is not just the flip-flop from one side of the brain to the other, but actually a resolution of this duality, of this contradiction. And so this leads him into what looks like foolishness. Remember, God chooses the foolish to confound the wise, he says in another passage. So it looks like foolishness because he's saying, well, what I'm actually boasting of are my weaknesses. If I'm going to draw attention to anything, it will be my weaknesses, because it's through my weaknesses that the power of Christ dwells in me. So this is the first time he mentions Christ in this passage. He'd gone to paradise, he'd had this experience of the third heaven. He doesn't mention Christ there. And then he asks God to take away this thorn in the flesh, which was meant to keep him humble. Doesn't mention Christ. But Christ becomes meaningful in this description at this point, where he sees the power of God, the power of reality, manifesting in his weaknesses. So you could say here then that Christ becomes a kind of mediator between these extremes, just as in the Christian wisdom, Jesus is the Word made flesh, the incarnation, the humanization, the human embodiment of God. A kind of adapter. You know, we've all probably brought our adapters here to plug in our phones or computers. So to adapt from one kind of flow of energy to another. So Jesus is this kind of adapter, universal adapter. And so it is in this reality, or this person of Christ, that all dualities must be resolved. Because if you resolve the duality between the human and the divine, you have pretty well covered all dualities. Mind and matter, and life and death. And so he concludes this little hymn, really, of this sort of ecstasy, ecstatic expression of his experience, of his insight, of his faith, by saying, when I am weak, then I am strong. But if you get to the point where you can really say that, and may be surprised at yourself saying it, you have pretty well solved the problem of failure. When I am weak, then I am strong. The essence, really, of Christianity. So, another example of this kind of experience that takes us out of our usual way of measuring failure and success. St. Thomas Aquinas, great 13th century Dominican theologian, sort of constructed this great architecture of the Summa Theologica, this sort of great achievement of the left hemisphere. Every kind of thought, every question that he could have about God and humanity was being discussed in a dialogical way. And then one day in 1273, on the feast of St. Nicholas, he was saying Mass, and during the Mass he had an experience, similar, I suppose, to what St. Paul was describing, a vision. And he then said to his secretary, and he never wrote any more. He said to his secretary, "The end of my labors have come. All that I have written appears to be as so much straw after the things that have been revealed to me." So he left his great work unfinished. What was failure? What was success in that? We can still benefit from the Summa Theologica. It speaks and to many of the questions and approaches we want to take. But what is, from his own experience, it seems as if he saw it, if not as a complete failure, but at least certainly as something that could be discarded. So, let's take a look at the poem, and then we'll go for our walk in a minute. Could you just close that one? No, I'd leave that in case we all asphyxiate. Thank you. So, would somebody like to read it or recite it from memory? Okay, thank you, Eddie. Oh, good.
Not bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. A quick-eyed love,
Observing
me grow slack.
From my first entrance in,
drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I Ah, my dear, I dare not look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. And know ye not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then let me serve.
You must sit down,
You must sit down
says love.
and taste my meat, so I can sit indeed.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you very much. So, who is the conversation between, or the dialogue? God, God. Okay. Is the word? Does it mention God at all?
No, God is love.
So we assume it's God. Okay, but it's love. Okay. And what's the first thing love does in the poem? Huh? Bids me welcome. Says hello. What does what does that suggest, or what does that mean, or what does it make us think of? That love is welcoming us. What is it? What do you feel when you're welcomed? Okay, accepted. Loved, yes. So when love welcomes, yeah. So you feel accepted. You feel loved by love. Yeah. Wanted, yes. So it's like you walk into a shop and they welcome you. They don't just the assistants don't just look angry that you've walked in and you're going to disturb their quiet morning. So you really feel welcomed. And what does that make us feel when we feel welcomed like that?
Well with ourselves.
Well with ourselves, yes. Embraced, embraceable. Huh? Happy, yes, okay, so it's just happy. So love bade me welcome. So when we feel welcomed by love, or in a loving way, we expect to feel happy, embraced, loved. But what does the I of the poem feel or do? Yeah. He says, my soul drew back. Doesn't say I, but anyway, I suppose it's tantamount to an I. But when you say my soul, what does that imply? See, my soul is feeling troubled. Jesus said, my soul is troubled even unto death.
My true self.
Could be my true self. My inner being. The fears within oneself. So there's a detachment here from ourselves, isn't there? When you say my soul, or my mind, or my body, there's a sort of detachment. And apparently it's the front lobes of the brain which have grown so much more in humans than in any other animal, which gives us this capacity for detachment, to be able to step back from our environment or our experience and look at it, reflect on it. So we're seeing the poet, say Herbert, who was a very self-observing kind of poet, a very introspective poet. If you read the biography, which is up on the book table there, it's both a very good biography and a very good critical biography of his poetry. And you'll see how much of his life, perhaps the reason he wasn't much of a success in the world that he was born into, the academic world or the social world, or was because he was so introspective and so self-observing, and this became his poetry. His poetry is born painfully out of his self-observation, his self-reflection, his detachment from himself. You see? Okay, so, okay, 1 second. So his soul draws back. So love is welcoming him. He should be feeling all those things we imagine we would feel when we are welcomed and loved, but he draws back. And why does he draw back? What's he feeling? What makes him draw back? Guilty of? Well, yes. Well, but the two words he actually uses are guilty of dust and sin. So how can you be guilty of dust? What's the dust? The body. Okay. Things you haven't done. You don't see clearly. Okay, external things. Roaming. Roaming. Okay. Dust and sin.
The nearest nothing.
It
is the nearest nothing.
Nearest to nothing. Okay.
I think it points forward to what he says later on. He's marked his own eyes. Isn't that the dust points forward to the dust? Real vision.
Okay. So dust, yes. I mean, dust is, what is dust? Dust is detritus. Dust is, it's the aftermath of something, isn't it? You know, you clean the house and then a little bit later the dust, in London anyway, the dust settles again very quickly. So it's this dust is a sort of, you don't quite know where it comes from, but it's that feeling of dirt. I mean, dust, to be dusty is to be dirty, yeah?
Mortality.
And mortality. Yes. Yeah, I think for a priest like him, who would have conducted these conducted funerals, remember, man, that thou art dust, and unto dust thou shalt return.
Jesus said, shake the dust, his disciples off your feet.
Okay. Yes. Yes. So he's not able to shake the dust off himself. Now, guilty is a strong word here, because why should you be guilty of dust? Sin, maybe, yes, you could understand. He did wrong things, or he's got caught up in bad practices or bad attitudes.
I think dust stands for what she said. He didn't do something, so dust comes.
Okay. Well, certainly for Herbert, he probably did struggle with the feeling that he had failed in his own life. He'd failed to fulfill his talents. I mean, that's quite possible. Okay, well, let's go and shake the dust off our feet and see if Giovanni can awaken us. So maybe George Herbert would have felt better if he'd done a few more sessions like that. Then he might not have written his poetry. And many of the most beautiful things we make or discover are made or come into being through this tension, this conflict within ourselves between these two hemispheres of the brain, or between the idea of failure and success, or converting failure into success, or allowing success to expire and lead us back into failure. So it isn't that we are necessarily wasting our time when we're in this tension. There's a beautiful piano sonata by Beethoven, Opus 131, I think, which usually there are just two movements, and the whole work is this clash, really, between the two ends of the keyboard, and endless weaving in and out and clashing and rising to crescendos, and then eventually in the second movement this duality, this clash, this friction and pain of the duality is transcended, and there becomes this release, this amazing waterfall of joy and lightness. He becomes almost jazz-like. He just overflows as this duality is resolved, this tension is resolved. So anyway, this tension is often a creative tension, even though it can cause us a great deal of pain. Okay, so love welcomes the poet, yet my soul draws back, and the single word that stands out here is guilty, often associated with failure, isn't it? Nobody feels, proud of failure. So guilty of dust and sin, and two kinds of guilt here. I mean, the guilt, if the dust refers to just his mortality, his dirty humanity, just the feeling Shakespeare had at times, seemed to have at times, of almost a disgust with the natural world. At other times, of course, he celebrated it, but there were times, like in Hamlet, where you feel there's this rejection of the world and of the earthiness of the world. So maybe here there's just this guilt associated almost like with original sin. It's not my fault, but I still feel guilty about it. And then sin, well, that is my fault. These are the things I've done, or probably the things I haven't done in his case. And he's trapped in this double pincer movement of guilt, sort of the guilt of the human species at its failure, our recurrent failures, and what's our biggest failure in these terms? Where we all go back into dust. So death, isn't it? I mean, that's how we'll have a look tomorrow maybe at how the medical profession sees failure is pretty much the failure of medical science to keep us alive. So anyway, so he draws back because of guilt. Guilt is associated with the feeling of personal or even collective failure. And then the third line, the but. So everything turns on this one little word, but. Love, so what does love do? Well, first of all, how does he describe love at this point? But quick-eyed. So what's quick-eyed mean? Sensitive, yeah. Observant, and he uses the word observing in the next phrase. Full of attention towards me, yes. Very clearly. So, you know, you walk into a shop, imagine, and the shop assistant welcomes you. But that might just be something superficial because their supervisor is there. But actually, the assistant then gives you attention. Can I help you, sir? Anything I can do? And so you feel that you're receiving attention. Okay. So, quick-eyed love, observing me, grows slack. Word slack, do you know the word slack? Who can describe slack? English speaking, Loose, okay, yes. Weak. Hesitating. Yes, that's good, very good. So, quick-eyed love notices that I am becoming weak, I'm hesitating, I'm pulling back from my first entrance in. So it is a bit like coming into a room, and love is welcoming me. I see love and hear love welcoming me. I'm conscious of it, but I pull back. Even I've only taken one step into the room, but I pull back because I'm feeling guilty. And is there a relationship between the advance that love is making and my feeling of guilt?
Fear.
Fear of?
Fear of intimacy. Someone's coming towards you.
Okay, fear of intimacy. Someone's coming towards you. And when love comes towards you, what's going to happen next? You feel validated eventually. Yeah, okay. You need to engage. Yes. So, love is just saying hi, but that means we have to, or he has to respond.
You don't feel ready.
He doesn't feel ready, maybe, yeah?
He's withdrawing, isn't he?
Exactly, he withdraws. He's putting up his barriers.
There's a space.
There's a space, a distance, yes.
But love's getting near.
Well, and then love, yes. Well, that's what we see. The poem is about love not pulling back. Yes?
Perhaps love actually, without meaning to, shows him who he is in guilt.
Yes.
He only becomes aware of it
Yes.
in that moment.
Yes. So this is interesting, isn't it? That love is coming to greet him and you would think that he would want to respond, or he would be pleased to be loved, but actually it makes him aware of his guilt, and so it sort of activates his guilt. Now this is the question, what is he actually guilty of? He doesn't say, he just says dust and sin. Rather vague, but there's something that love has awakened in him which is causing him to reject or to pull back. To pull back is to reject, isn't it?
I'm thinking of the generosity of Jesus over the disciples in the form of fish, and Peter says apart from.
Yes, okay. Yes, on several occasions, particularly, for example, the Last Supper, Peter always shows us what not to do. He's a great teacher. You know, you need a pope like Pope Francis to understand that. You know, because otherwise they all think that Peter is a failure, isn't he? He fails to understand what Jesus is talking about. Jesus tells him to get behind him. He's Satan. He betrays him, denies him. So he's a complete failure. And yet, you know, the medieval papacy becomes this infallible institution of total success. You know, it somehow missed the point of Christianity, which is when I am weak, then I am strong. So, okay, so we're seeing human weakness at its most vulnerable and painful and almost embarrassing, because Herbert here is realizing how weak he is, how unable he is because of his guilt to accept the invitation of love, the welcome of love. Well, it can't be anything more shameful than that, and he uses the word guilt and shame in the poem in the sense of failure.
So like the prodigal son.
Yes?
Story of the whole poem.
Yes, the prodigal son story is definitely in here, yeah. So quick-eyed love is very observant, very attentive, sees that he's withdrawing, he's getting loose and slack, even from the first encounter, this very first step into, what is it he's walked into? Where is this, where do you think this might be happening? His first entrance in, what has he entered into? Huh? His inside, his interiority, yeah? Friendship, yes. Relationship, yes. This is the very first encounter. So he's not doing very well, is he? This is his first date. And he's decided he hasn't even, I was talking to somebody recently who had made a date on a what do you call, you know, online dating thing, and so they had gone to meet this person at the, I don't know, the station, tube station somewhere, but recognized them because of what they were wearing or some identifying feature, but their courage failed them, or the attraction died at that same instant, and they drew back. Whether it was guilty of dust and sin or not, I don't know. Or the picture didn't do justice to the, or did more justice than the original. Anyway, so from the very first encounter, he draws back. But quick-eyed love, it's as if love has noticed him and isn't going to withdraw his love's attention. So what does love do then? Love draws nearer. What would that make you feel? You approach someone, then you think, no, this isn't right, I'm going to pull back, and they draw nearer to you as you draw back. What?
Where we stop there?
Yeah. Boundaries, keep your boundaries.
Increase your value.
Increase?
Your value.
Your value, okay, right. Value is increased. Yes? I mean, you will have probably a divided response, I think. On the one hand, you can't help that you're annoyed because just leave me alone. Stop harassing me. Okay. On the other hand, you can't help but feel that you are the object of their attention. And it's, after all, it's love that is drawing nearer to you. So there's it sort of reveals the internal tension and contradiction within yourself, out of which this guilt has arrived. He's really being exposed to himself, isn't he? So love continues to draw nearer to him, and then what does love do? Sweetly questioning. Yes. Well, the sweet is a very strong word. It's not, what other kind of questioning could there be?
Gentle.
Could be gentle, yes. What else? I mean, it's not like a policeman questioning you, is it? You know. But what is he, and it is a question. Jesus is known as a teacher, he's called a teacher more often than by any other title in the Gospels. And one of the ways you can see this is he's always asking questions rather than giving answers. I mean, he writes haikus or he gives parables, but on the whole, he doesn't sort of answer all the questions in the way that Thomas Aquinas wanted to do. But he asks questions. The very first words of Jesus in the Gospel of John to the disciples who he notices following him, he's quick-eyed, he sees them following him, and then he turns and sees them and he says, "What are you looking for?" Yeah. So the right question, like a good therapist or a good teacher, can be much more powerful than a judgment or a criticism or even giving people your opinion. He's asking a question. The question has an effect on us, depending on where the question is coming from. And this question that love is asking here is sweetly questioning. So what would that make you feel if you were drawing back and love is coming closer to you? So you will feel maybe love is invading your space and crossing the boundary that you want to keep to yourself. But the form or the spirit of the movement of love here is in the form of a question, and it is sweet. So what is that going to make you feel? Overwhelmed. And? No fear. Yes, okay. So I think, yes, it's the beginning of a relationship. It's not, the relationship could, at this point, it could have become oppositional, couldn't it? Stop following me. But actually, this withdrawing seems to have been paused. He's held by a sweet question.
It's reassuring.
And it's reassuring?
Because actually, if the poem starts that it sounds like we've stepped into the place of love and we're welcome. It's not love. Love hasn't come into our space. We've come into the place of love and we're welcome. Then we draw back, and then there's this reassurance, this sweet reassurance.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so, and the sweetness of the reassurance is in the form of a question. And what is the question? Do you lack anything? Is there something you don't have? To lack is to miss. I don't have it. So it's an interesting question, isn't it? He doesn't say, what are you looking for? He doesn't say, what do you want? What does he say? What's missing? What's missing in you? Or well, he's not even saying, that might be a bit threatening. He's actually saying, are you missing anything? Is there anything you need? Because if you lack something, it's another way of saying you need something. And what might it be he needs? What does he need so far? Okay, forgiveness? Even faith? Huh? Comprehension, understanding, acceptance, healing. So lots of different aspects of something that he needs, that he hasn't got, he lacks. And perhaps it is out of that lack, or that not having something he needs, that the guilt arises. And it's the guilt that makes him pull back. So, quite a lot to think about in that's only the first verse. So, it's a good moment to reflect on how we see the poem in terms of our own experience. The reason it is such a great poem, I think, is that it speaks to us individually, as well as saying something about the human condition and human nature. And there is a dance here, or a sense of opposition. There's love and me. There's the movement of love and the failure to respond. And then there is the continued work of love working on me, working in order to bring me to some other place. And it does that by asking a very pointed question: what's up with you? You know, what's the matter? Do you know? I mean, and when you ask that question, you have to think about it. What is it I don't have that I need, that I should have, and that I must have in order to respond?
Is it that he needs a positive experience of love?
Yes?
He associates love with his higher experiences, which have caused him pain.
Sure.
And that's why he's unable to engage until love convinces him that maybe it will be.
Yes. 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 I mean, I think that's very true. it is, of course, very often our, as you say, prior experiences that shape our present response. That's the left hemisphere. Left hemisphere, which is putting together all our experiences of the past and making conscious or unconscious decisions to avoid the kind of experiences we had. But maybe those formative experiences were very pre-conscious even. And if you look at his life, it wasn't a dramatic life, but we know enough about it because they were all very literate and self-expressive. It may be something in his childhood that gave him this type of temperament. Yeah. But coming through this, of course, is self-knowledge. I mean, this first verse of the poem is the stimulation of self-knowledge. Painful. Now, you could read this almost as the first step you make in meditation. And you take the first step in, and then you draw back. I can't do this for one reason or another. Sometimes it stirs up a lot of sludge. Or you see aspects of yourself you just don't feel comfortable with. So you just withdraw. Yeah. Then you find yourself stuck on a retreat you can't get out. So we go on to the next meditation. Okay, thank you.